Okay, thank you, Jeff. I am honored to be here, and this time as a co-organizer with Jeff, Karin, and Bill. The conference and the archives comprise a center, a point in place and time where the impossible meets its researchers, its experiencers, and its curious seekers. When I think of the diversity of people in attendance here today, all engaged in the study of this topic, I'm reminded of the famous Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin, who said, "There's less difference than people think between research and adoration." I'd like to pick up two threads from Jeff's remarks. First, that the only thing he is certain of is that he is not certain of anything, and that there is an ongoing conversation. Each of these claims sounds so simple and ordinary. On the one hand, a position of humility, and on the other, a conversation. Yet, upon further scrutiny, each is packed with information that, in my opinion, has been forgotten, ignored, or overshadowed by modern ideas of what constitutes good thinking. There is another person who, about 2,400 years ago, focused intently on these two ideas, and that was Socrates. We've all heard of this famous Greek philosopher from a course in high school or at the university. Socrates was known in his day as the most intelligent human being on earth, not because he said he was, but because he said he did not know anything. After we learned about Socrates in college, we probably forgot about him because his ideas didn't seem particularly relevant to our lives. Sure, Socrates was humble, just like Jeff. The position of humility, which is what I call this, in this case means to refrain from reaching an entrenched conclusion. It means being open to data as it presents itself. It appears to be a gateway to a conversation with the impossible, with knowledge that comes on its own and enters the mind fresh and unbidden. The humble position is actually an epistemology, which is a fancy word that means a theory of knowledge. But it is more than that. It is a way to access knowledge. Jeff calls it a conversation, and so did Socrates. So, to be clear, being aware that you do not know anything is first and foremost a position of reception and a research position that allows knowledge to find you. And I will return to this point. I'd like now to go back in time to when I met Jeff and started a conversation with him that continues to this day. In 2011, my editor, Cynthia Reed, introduced me to Jeff as a person who might blurb my book about the Catholic doctrine of purgatory. Initially, this had nothing to do with UFOs. I had already read a few of Jeff's books, and I still consider Authors of the Impossible to be in my top 5 favorite and most impactful reading experiences. To say the least, I was thrilled to meet Jeff. And when I met him in person, I brought along my book, copy of Authors of the Impossible, not only to have him sign it, but also to show him how much the book meant to me. I had it marked up, dog-eared almost every page, taped half the pages with colorful markers, and had highlighted it in several colors, so much so that it no longer resembled a book, but it looked more like a modern piece of art. When I brought the book out of my backpack, Jeff was taken aback and said something like, "Put that away." And then we began a conversation about UFOs. This was many years ago, before Leslie Kean's groundbreaking New York Times article, when the topic was still discussed in hushed tones behind closed doors. Jeff and I shared a background in religious traditions, particularly the Catholic tradition. After a few conversations, something in me shifted. It was as if I had been handed a new set of lenses. In a flash, the traditional angelic contact events I had studied for most of my life, encounters like those of St. Francis of Assisi or Teresa of Avila, they suddenly looked very different. I shared this insight with Jeff. He paused and then said, it appears that we have to rethink the whole Catholic tradition. And he's right. That moment marked a turning point in my life, a year defined by what John Mack called ontological shock. We've all heard of this. Mack used the term to describe the profound cognitive and existential disorientation experienced by individuals who encounter something that fundamentally upends their assumptions about reality. In UFO abduction and contact narratives, this shock is often marked by the collapse of materialist or rationalist worldviews, a sudden confrontation with entities or experiences beyond consensus reality, a spiritual or metaphysical crisis, often followed by long-term transformation. When you read the original accounts of angelic contacts, not just admire them in museums, like the European museums, of course, we've all seen them, what you find mirrors modern UFO reports, shining aerial phenomena, levitations, apparent telepathic communication. The parallels are striking. This is what the humble position offers, a profound shock. But if you stay open, you'll find yourself in a conversation, one far older and far stranger than you expected. And I'll explain that. After my eyes were updated, so to speak, I not only revised my understanding of religious history, but I began to intuit that there was a conversation. This was a conversation with theorists like Jeff, but also with theorists who were long past, but have left a deposit of their deepest thoughts, which are their books. I recognized that I was in a conversation with several thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche, Hannah Arendt, and others, and I accessed the streams of these conversations not just through their books, but through events related to their books. And by the way, when I sat down, I read that one part down here that says, if, however, paranormal phenomena are meaning events that work and look a great deal like texts, then it follows like texts can also work and look a great deal like fill in the blank. You all know. This is what I'm getting at, and I know I didn't know that was going to be there. So, through events related to their books, and I am not speaking metaphorically, I've written about these events, and I call them book encounters. Book encounters happen when, during the course of your seeking and research, and it doesn't have to be a book, of course, you happen upon the right book at the right moment, often synchronistically. These experiences are often spectacular. And here's an anecdote that somewhat illustrates my point. When I was an assistant professor, I had a mentor. He was a history of religions professor and a strict rationalist. He did not believe in or speak about telepathy or coincidences. On the eve of his retirement, he related something which was atypical for him. He told me that he engaged in conversations with his deceased advisors in his dreams, and that these conversations were actually very helpful to his research. I was shocked, and was further shocked when he said that he experienced these very often. Although his advisors were gone, he maintained a conversation with them in his dreams. Years later, after my flip year of studying UFOs, I recognized that I was in, and it had been, in active dialogue with people within the historical record. I felt that they, like my mentor's advisors, engaged me in dialogue about their ideas. They goaded me to relate them to our current era, and often I didn't really want to do this, by the way. Going back to Nietzsche, he used to say that his audience was comprised of philosophers of the future, and he wrote this in the late 1800s. He knew that he would be dead when his work finally found its audience. That's so depressing. I suspect that we are his readers, the philosophers of his future. One of his books, Untimely Meditations, reflects this idea that the most important philosophical insights are often untimely. They go against the prevailing cultural trends, but will likely be well received decades, sadly even centuries later. So it must be hard to be Friedrich Nietzsche, and I think that we know that that's true. Years of researching UFO events brought me finally to Plato's famous allegory of the cave. So I come back to Socrates, which is found in his book called Plato's Republic. It is not a coincidence that all of Plato's books are written as dialogues, as conversations. When we learn about Socrates at the university or even in high school, we are never taught that primary to his philosophy, the crux even, is a conversation. Plato's Republic is one of the most influential works in Western philosophy. He wrote it around 380 before the Common Era, and it is a conversation between, of course, dead advisors. Okay, so Socrates, Plato's advisor, is passed away. Most of the characters in the book that are in conversation with each other are passed away. They discuss ultimate questions like the nature of justice, the ideal form of government, and the human soul. It also discusses deception and what I would call the nature of media, even though he doesn't, of course, use that word media. In the book, Socrates presents various forms of government in often ludicrous ways. And you wonder if these ways in which he presents these forms of government, was he serious? Like, I know a lot of my philosophy professors say, yeah, he was serious. But then I get to, he famously suggests that states should be ruled by philosophers, and I'm like, nah, he wasn't serious. He goes through different iterations of government in order to arrive at an ideal just state. But in the end, he doesn't actually provide an answer about how that's going to look. I always thought, why doesn't he just get to the point? I was reading with my Enlightenment frame, right? Instead, the Republic veers off course as Socrates relates a story. This story is about a soldier's near-death experience. Socrates also presents the allegory of the cave. So a near-death experience, what does this have to do with creating a just state? I used to ask my philosopher friends, what is going on with the NDE? I didn't get it. And by the way, is this not the first NDE recorded in history? They didn't understand it either. And they said, you know, this is an ancient text. You need to let this go. But my UFO research taught me to look at the weird. It taught me to see things that didn't make sense and to try at least to figure it out. So I didn't give up on Plato's Republic. After a few years of struggling with it, I realized that the near-death experience of the soldier, coupled with the allegory of the cave, functioned performatively, just as did the format of the dialogues. They performed Socrates' answer to the question of justice and the state. The soldier's story reveals that there is a soul, and one's actions in life determine one's future in another either afterlife, post-life, or reincarnation. The soul was instrumental in creating a just state. Death and conversations with the dead dominate Plato's Republic and Plato's writings generally. These elements are there for a reason. The crux of Socrates' thought, as I suggested earlier, is about a conversation. In the Republic, the conversation comes after Socrates' devastating critique of the state of humanity. And by the way, it's still relevant. So if any of you have seen The Matrix, The Truman Show, or have read Brave New World, you'll readily understand the contours of the allegory because they are based on that, like so many other, you live in a simulation type of narrative today. In the allegory, prisoners live in a cave, and they mistake shadows on the cave wall for reality. Liberation begins when one identifies that one lives within the prison of the cave. Socrates' insight is that liberation begins and is sustained by a conversation. Here I will read from a translation of the Republic. Socrates is speaking to Glaucon, Plato's brother. There must be a craft of some kind which would be a most efficient and effective means of transforming the soul. It would not be an art that gives the soul vision, but a craft at labor under the assumption that the soul has its own innate vision, but does not apply it properly. There must be some kind of means for bringing this about. And Glaucon says, yes, such a craft, it must exist. This conversation or practice is today known as the dialectic, a method of questioning and dialogue to draw out knowledge, which initiates the turning around of the soul, a reorientation. I suggest that the UFO phenomena is not so much a disorientation, although it can feel like that, but rather a reorientation with benefits.